All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us on this unfortunately rainy Wednesday. Welcome to Fair Housing Month. As stewards of the American dream, we know that ensuring fair housing opportunity is more than a list of do's and don'ts, rights and penalties, and mandatory continuing education. It requires knowledge, understanding, and commitment. I'm Wesley Stefanik. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Delaware Association of Realtors, and again, thank you all for joining. Every April, realtors in particular commemorate the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968 with events and education that shine a light on housing discrimination and segregation. Fair Housing Month signifies a recommitment to expanding equal access to housing. This year, the DAR Diversity and Inclusion Committee, chaired by Denise Foreman Gaines, who's on the call, hi Denise, took additional steps to make sure our association is doing its part to recognize this occasion. I hope that everyone was able to see an email that we had actually sent out a few days, maybe a week ago now, of everything we have planned for the month ahead. Today, as you're all here, we have our first session of the month titled Enforcing the Fair Housing Act in the First State, which will begin in just a second. And then on April 7th, you'll receive an email about the launch of our new diversity-related book club. On October, I don't know where October is coming from. April 14th, you'll receive information about the launch of a brand new DAR Minority Scholarship. On April 19th, Lori Benner from the National Fair Housing Alliance will join us for a presentation titled Creating Pathways to Homeownership for People of Color. And lastly, on April 21st, we will be launching our brand new program called the DAR Fair Housing Champion Certification. I'm personally looking forward to a great month of announcements and DAR's commemoration of Fair Housing Month. So now back to today. For today's session, please note that we are recording it and it will be available on our DAR video library shortly after this event at delawarerealtor.com. Also note, if you're brand new to Zoom, there is a button on the top right corner of your screen. It says view. If you don't like the format of the view you're watching right now, you can rotate to make a change. Everyone will be muted for the duration of this event, so please put any questions in while the presenters are presenting. We will be able to open it up later, but for the time being, everybody is muted. But you can put comments in the chat box. So with that, I'd like to welcome Natalie Fountain and Inez Hungria from the Delaware Human Relations Commission. Natalie is the Education and Trading Coordinator for the Commission. Inez is the most senior investigator, and they'll go a bit more into that. So I'm thrilled to have the both of you here today, and take it away, Natalie.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. And Inez is actually has moved into the supervisory role. So I'll let her talk a little bit more about that, but she supervises the investigator. So yay to Inez, she's the genius and the brain trust in the agency, but I am the talker and she is the brain trust. So I go to her for all kinds of input and suggestions. So welcome, everybody. Good morning. Thank you all for being here inviting us to be with you today. As Wes said, I am the Education and Training Coordinator. So I'm the person that does the trainings. If we have community organizations, folks who are interested in learning about fair housing, as well as folks who will participate in training as part of an agreement with the agency. So I know that you guys get some fair housing training, but I want to run through real quick. A PowerPoint just kind of touches on the history of fair housing, why we got to where we are today, why we have the laws. And one of our investigators is a real estate agent, and she said that she's very familiar with the training you all get and appreciates the learning that she's gotten from participating in some of the trainings that I have done. So I hope you will appreciate it too. We'll leave time at the end for question and answers. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. So welcome to Enforcing the Fair Housing Act in the state of Delaware. One of the things that I've found interesting in kind of putting some material together for that is the quote from your NAR website. It's a robust source of information. If you're like me, you probably don't get a chance to look at your own leading agency. I don't look at HUD's website all the time, but I found that, you had a quote in there, the nation and realtors did not, and NAR did not always support fair housing rights. In fact, NAR opposed passage of the Fair Housing Act, and at one time allowed local associations to exclude members based on race or sex. Our understanding of fair housing rights changed over time, and today NAR leads efforts to expand those rights. So I want to applaud you and thank you for inviting us to join you today and to engage as partners committed to furthering fair housing rights for all. So the State Human Relations Commission and the Division of Human Relations are the agencies that enforce and promote laws against discrimination and foster amicable relationships within Delaware's various cultural, racial, and ethnic groups. We are a diverse state, and our commission is a diverse commission. It's made up of 18 commissioners. They are volunteers who apply to serve on the commission. They're appointed by the governor. There are 5 commissioners for each county, and there are 3 who serve at large. They serve a dual role in addition to being the eyes and ears of the commission on the ground. They are in their communities. They let folks know, they serve on the Human Relations Commission that supports amicable relations. They are the people who their community members, they keep an eye on what's happening, and they let folks know, hey, we're here to promote amicable relationships and also to enforce laws against discrimination. So they have a dual role in terms of being community engagement people, but also serve on hearing panels. And the hearing panels, I'll talk a little bit more about that. They occur if a case comes to the agency and it cannot be conciliated, the commissioners will serve on the hearing panel. The Division of Human Relations is one of 14 Department of State agencies. So we are under the Department of State, and the Department of State, of course, is directly under the governor. We are a civil rights enforcement agency. We are not housing advocates. We're not a fair housing advocacy agency. We are neutral in any cases that come to the agency. We are substantially equivalent to HUD in investigating complaints and enforcing fair housing laws in the state of Delaware. So the division and the commission have two roles: enforcing the Fair Housing Act and enforcing the Equal Accommodations Act. The EA laws are the laws that allow, that prohibit discrimination against any member of a protected class in places that serve the public. So that would be stores, shops, restaurants, government agencies, schools, any place that's open to the public may not discriminate. And, any place, shops, parks, restaurants. So anyone who faces discrimination in a place that serves the public can also file a complaint with the Division of Human Relations. The dual role, of course, then is mediation, and that is the commission, mostly commission driven, and they'll mediate educational issues. We had a case where some LGBTQ students in Sussex County, for example, wanted to wear rainbow stoles when they graduated. And so one of our commissioners helped to mediate some disputes around that. Police conflict, neighborhood tensions, hate crimes, so they have I say we're like Atlas, carrying the world on our shoulders. And it's a very small agency, but committed people. So like the realtors, that's who we are, DHR, SHR, this is what we do. So fair housing has a long history in this country. The 1866 Civil Rights Act was signed in April 9th. Actually, April 11th, 1968 was 102 years later was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. So it's interesting. Both under Presidents Johnson. Andrew Johnson opposed the Civil Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson promoted it and was in favor of it. It was the first time Congress legislated on civil rights. And it said all citizens born in the United States were entitled to be citizens, but most primarily, it gave formerly enslaved people the right to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. So it's significant. 1910, we see our first legislated segregation law. Baltimore enacted the first racially restrictive zoning. It was a citywide law that mandated segregation of each city block. This is an actual ad. Look at these homes now. because an African-American lawyer had bought a 3-story row house at McCulloch Street. It was a prestige neighborhood at the time, but Blacks simply were not allowed to live in mixed neighborhoods. But people at the time lived where they could afford to live. So the Baltimore City Council enacted this law, and you can see the consequences of that segregation in Baltimore today. The law was overturned in 1917. A Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan versus Worley that said municipally mandated racial zoning was unconstitutional. Unfortunately, restrictive covenants then took the place. It was a practice of private, racially restrictive covenants, as Black Americans migrated from the South to the North and straight up from the South up to Chicago, which is became highly segregated city, and West. And in response to that Supreme Court ruling that declared municipally mandated racial zoning as unconstitutional, the Supreme Court in 1926 ruled that racial covenants on transactions between private parties could stay in place. So the National Association of Real Estate Boards actually created a covenant template for real estate agents and developers from Philadelphia to Spokane to use. And it paved the way for racially restrictive covenants throughout the country, further perpetuating segregation and, of course, continuing practices of discrimination. The 1934 redlining reinforced what the government had already started trying to do in 1910 and deepened segregation throughout the country. There were about 239 cities. And this occurred after, let me back up for a second. This occurred after the stock market crash of 1929. Of course, banks lost everything. Individuals lost everything. And so, there was the government intervened to address the housing crisis, to address the financial crisis, which had happened, of course, we've seen happen many times in our own lifetimes. And so the government said, the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation were created to assure banks that if they wrote loans, if they underwrote, that the government would underwrite these mortgages against foreclosure, against failure. It assured the banks that they would not lose money as they had in the stock market crash. But what the government also did was created the HOLC and sent appraisers out into 239 cities to map these areas. Philadelphia was one, Chester was one, Camden was one. I've not seen Wilmington was not one, so I cannot show you a HOLC map of Wilmington, but this is a 1939 map of Philadelphia. This is an appraisal report for Swarthmore. These residential security maps graded areas A through D. A was the best, D was the worst, and the D were drawn in red. They were based on racial assumptions, and they identified minority neighborhoods as unable to meet lending criteria and denied loans to people who lived in those neighborhoods to purchase homes in those communities. If you can't buy a home, you're stuck renting for forever. If you can't buy a home, if your neighborhood is considered undesirable, your property won't appreciate. Now there were, so this perpetuated segregation, and it's a form of, it's interesting to see how that persists today. So I'm not sure if you can see on this appraisal report of Swarthmore, it was about the cleanest I could get this to look, but it'll say up here grade A, and it's Swarthmore, Rolling Hills. But what I want to draw your attention to is inhabitants. Under C, it says foreign born, no, because people who were undesirable Europeans, particularly Eastern Europeans or Jewish people, no, and Negro, no. What I find interesting is in looking at the 2021 census data for Swarthmore, is in 1937, Swarthmore was graded A because it had no Negroes, it had no undesirables. Swarthmore today is 81.7% white. So the history impacts us today. It's important to recognize that these things that happened in the past are still having an impact today. And we need to take steps. I applaud the NAR for recognizing and moving in that direction as well. It's gratifying. Moving on in our nation's fair housing timeline, 1947, World War II, GIs were coming back. And again, there was a housing crisis. A lot of GIs were living in Quonset, with their families were living in Quonset huts, those kind of half circle shaped metal huts. There was such a housing crunch, the baby boom and housing crunch, that the government again stepped in and said, okay, well, we will lend you developers money, build houses. And so Joseph Levitt was one builder. He built Levittown in New York, and he built a Levittown in Pennsylvania. In New York, he built 17,500 mass-produced houses, 2-bedroom homes. They were about 9,000 to 17,000, fully equipped and landscaped. They, for zero down for vets and very little down for citizens. Homeowners paid around $60 a month in VA or FHA mortgages. And so these little houses these are some pictures from a couple years ago where people had added on to their Levittowners, increased the value of the property by improving the property. And I'll show you another one. Here's an advertisement. This one I think was a Cape Cod. They had different names. And so this is a picture of a Levittown, PA house. So you can see it was 8490, 2 or 3 bedrooms, fully furnished. They came with all the kitchen appliances that the modern housewife would want. But one of the things that happened in those property purchases was that Black Americans were denied. African-American GIs returning from World War II were denied access to those properties. The government said that there had to be a restrictive covenant embedded in each of those sales contracts that forbade the sale of a home to African Americans. The first family that tried to move into Levittown in 1957 used a straw man purchase to buy the house. And Bill and Daisy, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on their last name. They faced protests. People threw rocks through their window. They protested outside the home. This was in 1957 when they tried to move in. But what's important to recognize is that an individual who could buy into Levittown, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who could buy into Levittown at 8490 and pay off that home, were able to acquire equity. And equity is the way most people build wealth in this country, as you all know. But if you're a Black American and you can't buy, and you either have to buy in what's considered an undesirable area, a D or a C community, or your property, you never have a chance to purchase a reason in a community where you want to go and can afford to go, you're denied access to home equity. That equity means that you can't borrow against it if you improve your home and improve its value, or if you simply live in it and pass it on to your heirs. There's no generational transfer of wealth, and that leads to a racial wealth gap that is profound. This is a listing I pulled off Zillow for a house that doesn't look like it's been improved at all since it was built. This is a Levittown, PA home listed at 309. So you can see the huge wealth transfer did not occur for African-American, Black Americans in this country due to discrimination and racism and segregation. So this is the wealth gap in 2016. And that's a key to the American dream, is buying a house. And most people, 42% of the net worth of all households consists of the equity in their homes. Most people's biggest asset is their home. And it provides family stability, the means to start a business, to send their children to college. And so when you see the wealth gap of 2016, this huge gap, it has to be connected to, the denial of access to purchasing a home. Continuing the nation's actions, 1956, the interstate highway system. This is Baltimore. This is an aerial view of the city of Baltimore with the interstate running straight through it. This was 475,000 households were affected by the Interstate Highway, Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It's 41,000 miles nationwide highway improvements. Highways needed to be, again, we had, growth in the country, population growth, business growth, interstate commerce. We were in the Cold War. And so having this highway system was critical, at the time to being able to defend the country. But where were the areas that were selected for these highways to go? Well, they were what were considered slums, neighborhoods that were populated by primarily minority communities. And they cut through existing neighborhoods. They destroyed churches. The highways destroyed schools, small businesses. They divided communities that had been established and stable. And home values were destroyed as well. A stable community with no highway running through it has one set of values. If your house looks out onto I-95 or I-10 in New Orleans, your house value is not going to be the same as a house that's 3 miles away from that noise and that pollution and that dirt. What these highways also did was connected cities to suburbs that were off limits to non-white residents at that time. This is Wilmington. And so when we look at some of the issues that affect Wilmington today, some of that is related to the construction of I-95 straight through the city of Wilmington. This is I-95 and 4th Street. And this church barely escaped demolition when the highway was and it's a very active church today. This is a picture, you can see a picture of President Kennedy cutting the ribbon at the dedication of the Delaware Turnpike, I-95 at Maryland. So these are some factors that can't, have to be considered in why we are where we got to. Moving on, the Chicago Freedom Movement saw Dr. Martin Luther King at the request of civil rights groups move his family to the city of Chicago. The 1959 Commission on Civil Rights said Chicago was the most residentially segregated large city in the nation. And so civil rights groups asked Dr. King to bring the civil rights movement to the city of Chicago to help lead protests and actions and activity in support of fair and open housing. People were highly segregated in the city of Chicago, and where Black Americans were allowed to live was horrendous housing conditions. There is an undercover video that shot back in 1966, so it's interesting. The sound is not great. The camera work is not great, but it shows a Black family very comfortably, financially comfortable, going to different real estate agents trying to be shown houses and being told there were none. And then there was a woman who was working, a white woman working with this organization, and she was being shown houses or told properties were available. So, the denial of property, the denial of access was profound. And so in those marches and protests and speeches that Dr. King led, he said one of the most violent acts that he ever occurred in Chicago. He said in one of his speeches, he said, "I've dealt with a lot of hatred and racism down south, but I've never seen the hate against me like I've seen here in Chicago." But eventually the city said, okay, we will work with you and we will make an agreement to make city housing open and fair. And so they asked, that real estate boards and mortgage lenders make statements that they would not discriminate. The agreement was never really enforced, but it did lead and it inspired the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Dr. King and President Johnson had actually been working for 2 years, 1966 and 1967, to try to put fair housing legislation in front of Congress and the House, but they kept getting pushback until Dr. King was assassinated, April 11th, 1968. When Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, I think pent-up frustration occurred throughout the country. There were 127 civil disturbances at the time called riots, but people protest and they make their unhappiness known when people feel oppressed, they act out. We've seen protests and demonstrations against inequity and unfairness over the last couple of years. And at that time, when people were denied access to jobs, denied access to housing, restricted in where they could live, restricted in what they could do, tensions boiled over, and there were 125 or 127 civil disturbances throughout the country. Congress recognized they had to act. And so in 1968, April 11th, 102 years and 2 days after the first Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed. Included in that was the Fair Housing Act. At that time, the Fair Housing Act made it illegal to discriminate in sale, rental, or financing based on race, color, religion, and national origin. I apologize for that 19XX. I meant to look that up. I think it was 1979. The amendment to add sex was a protection based on sex, which meant that women could buy a house without having to have the signature of their husbands. And in 1988, the amendment to add familial status was added. So these are the 7 federal protected classes that exist in every country, every state in the country today. So fair housing laws are civil rights laws. The Fair Housing Act of 68 is a federal law, and Delaware's Fair Housing Act, which was signed in 1969, is a state law, both intended to eliminate discrimination in housing. They're both administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Act office, and it applies to all housing. So what's against the law? What's against the law to discriminate against someone because they belong to a protected class in any aspect of any housing related transaction? Anything having to do with housing. Renting, selling, financing, insuring, appraising, or providing services and facilities. And that might be access to a pool, providing access to a community center, someone who may have a service animal is not denied access to a community facility that's in a community, for example. So, it's a very broad coverage. What was that one thing? Okay. What kinds of actions might be discriminatory? Well, refusing to rent, sell, or negotiate for a residence. That I saw on your website, I think one of your websites, because I do a little research, there was a case where a real estate agent was working with a family to sell their home. The buyers of the home were African-American. When the sellers saw the name of the purchaser, her name was Ebony Brown. Where's my notes on that? Ebony Clinton Brown. When the sellers saw the woman's name, the buyer's name, they said, well, are they Black? And the real estate agent said, why? And they said, well, we won't sell to Black people. And so the real estate agent, to her credit, said that's against the law. And they said, well, we won't sell. So she terminated that client arrangement and reported it. So, even if your client refuses to rent or sell, that's a discriminatory action. Making housing unavailable or denying that housing is available, steering, not returning phone calls. These are the types of things that might be discriminatory. What else is prohibited? Running a discriminatory ad, whether it's a preference for or against, blockbusting, zoning laws. One of the things that is, housing advocates are looking for now is single family zoning. And things like ADUs that, because we have such a housing crisis, kind of looking at some of our single family zoning and how to accommodate the needs for housing with an affordability issue. Intimidating someone, denying a request for a reasonable accommodation. I won't read it, you all can see it all. I found it interesting. I was looking at your window to the law video, advertising within the fair housing framework, and your counsel was talking about how to advertise in a way that affirms fair housing. And I had to look up the term he used, Mexican doors. I know they use reasonable person standard. And I went, well, what's Mexican doors? And I found out it's a type of door, but even those kinds of things, just be careful, things like advertisements, some specialize in serving Polish clients would be discriminatory. Who must follow fair housing laws? Everybody on this list. Anybody who has anything to do with the provision of housing related transaction. So I won't read that. You all can read it. I'm watching the time, so I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. What are the types of discrimination prohibited by law? We have overt, differential, and disparate impact. Overt discrimination, we don't see that much. It's pretty obvious and it's pretty blunt and it's pretty in your face. And because it is blunt and obvious and in your face, we don't see it that much. It's blatant discriminatory treatment. Most people are not going to be that blatant in their discrimination. They may be inadvertently discriminatory in an advertisement, perfect for couples, great location for students, inadvertently, indicating a preference for, but we don't see much overt discrimination because it's blatant. What we see more of is differential treatment discrimination, and that's treating people differently because of their membership in a protected class. Finally, disparate impact discrimination. Disparate impact is a practice or policy that looks neutral on its face, but it could have a discriminatory effect on a group of people who are protected under the law, and the policy can't be justified by a business necessity. So what does that mean? Well, here's a couple of examples. Domestic violence survivors, a landlord space or housing community, complex, municipality may have a policy that says, we want a safe, quiet community. So if you call, emergency services for assistance more than once, if you have a domestic violence situation and most domestic violence victims are female, and they call for assistance, or the laws against battering, or they may send the perpetrator back into the home. So due to no fault of her own, a domestic violence victim may be evicted from her home, or may suffer fines and penalties. And the disparate impact could, because of this policy, could be against women, because typically 80% of domestic violence sufferers are females. Minimum value insurance policies. An insurance company says, well, we don't insure companies, properties under $75,000, even if it's in excellent condition. Well, because of this history of, discriminatory access to housing, this kind of policy can disproportionately exclude African-American or Latinx homeowners. And it can contribute to insurance redlining, where people can't get the most accessible policy at the best value for their property. So not just on an individual basis, but on a policy basis could have a disparate impact on a protected group. One of HUD's most recent actions, excuse me, under the guidance of President Biden, June of 2021, he directed HUD, which is one of the largest agencies under the federal government, to lead a interagency initiative to address inequity in home appraisals. It's called PAVE, and I know NAR had some input in the report. NAR had some input into the action, some of the decisions and some of the research that went into that. That interagency initiative is 13 different federal agencies who are all participating in looking at the issue of appraisals, property appraisal and valuation. The action plan was just released in March. And the goal is to really look at the impact of appraisals on property values. Now, I know NAR has some has some concerns or has some thoughts about some of the aspects of the report. I haven't read the whole thing, but the goal is, what it will do, the scope of it is to look at how the federal government, including potential enforcement under fair housing laws, can root out discrimination in the appraisal and home buying process. So, it's focused on rooting out this racial and ethnic bias. A low valuation, as can cause a sale to fall through. It can harm the buyer and the seller. And so, I don't think there is a got you focus on this as much as looking at, how can people be treated as fairly as possible. Um, um, so that the playing field is as level as possible. So what this is going to look like moving forward, none of us really knows, I think, but because the action plan was just announced, but I expect that we will start to see perhaps more complaints coming in regarding appraisals. I'm not sure, don't quote me. So real quickly, as I said, these are the 7 federal protected classes. Delaware has 6 additional protected classes. We provide protections for individuals who are 18 and up. Individuals who are under 18 are protected under the familial status protected class. And this is important for if you have like a college student. We had a college student came to our agency about 3 years ago, I want to say, who was dealing with some issues in the rental property that she and some of her other students, roommates were dealing with in a home. And so, if you have a college student renting a property, this law can protect them if they're denied housing because, we won't rent to students. And I like to point out that everybody who's on this call, if you're a Delaware resident, all of these laws protect you as well. So they have a dual purpose. They protect you, they protect those that you care about and love, and they are also, required for you to follow in your professional life. So personal protections apply to you as well. Marital status, single, married, otherwise. Gender identity is protected under Delaware law, and gender identity, and I don't get to federal legislation as well. Gender identity is defined as a gender-related identity, appearance, expression, or behavior of a person, regardless of that person's assigned sex at birth. Sexual orientation is protected under Delaware state law, and the law defines that as heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Creed, which is a non-formal religious belief. It doesn't have to be a formal religion. That's protected under federal law. Creed can be religious or non-religious. It's a belief system. And then source of income is our most recent addition to Delaware state law, but it does not obligate housing providers to accept Section 8 program, participate in Section 8 program. Sexual harassment is against fair housing laws. It includes demands for sex or sexual acts. So it's considered sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, and it is illegal. And it can occur, it's not, gender specific. It's a power dynamic. It can occur to anyone, by anyone, female, male, non-binary, non-gender conforming, transgender, queer, straight, or gay. The law recognizes 2 types: quid pro quo, which is something for something, or hostile environment. And that's behavior that makes living in a community, living in a home, such pervasive harassment that it makes the person uncomfortable to be in their home or property. HUD also has some additional protections against harassment dating back to 2016. Harassment is against the law, and any housing-based harassment. So, neighbor against neighbor harassment could be a violation of fair housing law depending on the type of harassment that occurs. New federal protections, and this goes back to when I said about our state protections. February of 21, January 21, the president issued in response to the Bostock Supreme Court Bostock finding, which said that discrimination based on sex and employment was against the law. The president said this applies across all federal agencies. And so the HUD memo that implemented February of 21, HUD issued a memo implementing the president's January executive order, and it extended federal fair housing protections against discrimination based on sex to include discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So now at the federal level, there's protection as well as at our state level. If discrimination occurs in conjunction with discrimination based on another protected characteristic like race or color or religion, all those bases will be included with the complaint. So I'm watching our time. I have a few more to go. I want to go real quick through fair housing protections for persons with disabilities. They protect buyers and renters who have a disability, a disabled person who resides with someone else, a person associated with a disabled buyer or renter, or a person who's perceived as disabled. So someone who's perceived as disabled, this might be someone with a mental health condition who doesn't recognize that they have a disability, but they are perceived as such, or a person associated with a disabled buyer or renter, perhaps someone who is a caregiver or care provider, I think, who comes to the home of a person with a disability. That person would be protected under fair housing laws against harassment or some kind of negative treatment. Disabled people, we have cases where children with disabilities, or the parents can file complaints because they have a child with a disability. The fair housing laws, under fair housing laws, people with a disability are the only group that can be treated differently, and that treatment is necessary for them to ensure the equal opportunity for the full use and enjoyment of their dwelling. So the Fair Housing Act has specific definitions of what's considered a person with a disability, but basically a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. And those activities of daily living, it does not include current illegal use of or addiction to a controlled substance. So major life activities are functions like caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing. And the diseases like orthopedic, visual, speech, hearing impairment, cerebral palsy, autism, those are all part of the joint statement issued under HUD and DOJ that are the types of disabilities and diseases that will be protected. Mental retardation, emotional illness, drug addiction, recovery, not active. So what qualifies a person? I think I covered that already. The types of protections that are available for people with a disability are reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. And there has to be a nexus between their disability and the request. What that means is there has to be connection. A person who has a walking impairment and asks for a assigned parking spot, there is a nexus between their mobility disability and the request for an accommodation to have a parking space in a non-parking community. A person who has a walking disability and requests to install to modify their structure, their facade of their home in a 55 plus community that has, their design requirements. If they ask to modify their home because they now use a walker or a wheelchair to put in a ramp, that there is a nexus between their disability and the request. So the Fair Housing Act makes it illegal to discriminate, to refuse to make reasonable accommodations. And what HUD looks for, what we would look for if a complaint comes to us, is what's called the interactive dialogue. That's making sure that a housing provider responds and engages with the person making the request, doesn't just say no up front. That would be considered straight up discriminatory. So modifications are physical changes. They might be things like a ramp, automatic door closers, grab bars in a shower or bathroom, a blinking light to replace a doorbell for a hearing impaired person. Must be reasonable, and they're necessary to afford the person the full use and enjoyment of their property. Reasonable accommodations are exemptions from resident rules, policies, practices, or services. So those would be a parking space in a complex that doesn't have assigned parking. A person who has PTSD to have an assistance animal in a no pets community or a no pets condominium. And they're not reasonable if they impose an undue financial or administrative burden, but that has to be shown. So the Fair Housing Act does have some exemptions. All properties are covered except for single family homes that are rented or sold by an owner, as long as they own fewer than 3. You still cannot discriminate in in advertising. Even if you own 2 homes and you can rent to whoever you want, or you can sell as long as you don't use a broker, which of course you guys wouldn't apply, but individuals who FSBO can sell on their own, they can rent to whoever they want. as long as they own fewer than 3, and they cannot discriminate in advertising. Housing that's built by nonprofit religious groups, they cannot discriminate. They can only discriminate. They cannot discriminate based on race, color, or national origin. Members of the housing can be part of the religious group, but the organization cannot discriminate based on race, color, or national origin. An owner-occupied unit with no more than 4 unrelated families, that's the Mrs. Murphy exemption. So if it's a 4-unit building and I live in one, I can rent to the other 3 to whoever I want. Again, I cannot discriminate in advertising. And then 62 plus housing and 55 plus housing. So these are the properties that are exempt under fair housing law. Still cannot discriminate in advertising. So the act doesn't guarantee a person the right to housing they can't afford. Landlord sellers, they have the right to choose anybody as long as the decision is based on objective criteria applied to everybody, and as long as the criteria don't have that disparate impact on members of protected classes. So who can file a complaint? We can get directly from anybody who's been aggrieved, somebody who claims they've been injured, somebody who believes an act of discrimination is about to occur. Person can include government entities. That includes our commission. We can do commission-initiated complaints on behalf of fair housing organizations. We also receive complaints from HUD. So if a complaint goes into the HUD 877 number, eventually it will come to us. What happens when a complaint is filed? It starts when the complaint is served. It'll be completed within 100 days. The investigation starts once the complaint is served. And Inez can answer more of these questions because she runs this whole thing. Part of that complaint investigation process is a fact-finding conference, brings the parties together, the complainant and the respondent. It's an informal investigative conversation process. The parties meet to discuss the allegations. That's scheduled within 30 days after the complaint is served. At any time during the investigation, the parties can come to what's called a conciliation. That's a no-fault agreement. If they are unable to conciliate, the investigation can continue. And at any point in the process, the parties can agree to conciliate the complaint. If that does not happen, then it goes to a hearing. At the hearing, there's a panel of commissioners who listen to the facts of the case. Again, we are a neutral party. We're an investigative agency, not advocates. So the facts of the case are presented by the respondent, their witnesses, their representation, if they have any, the complainant, their witnesses, representation, if they have any. Once the facts of the case have been presented, our commissioners will then take the information and look at it. And at that point, they will come to a decision whether there's reasonable cause to believe discrimination occurred. If yes, they issue a charge of discrimination. If they said there's no reasonable cause, there's no cause, then the case is dismissed. Either party can appeal to the decision with the Superior Court, but we are at that point then done. So fair housing cases in Delaware. Inez, do you want to pop in on this? Or in 2020 case year, I'll keep going since we're getting close to time. In 2020 case year, we investigated, processed, and closed 30 cases. In the 2021 case year, we're expecting to close 45 cases. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about how long it takes to investigate a complaint, this isn't all the complaints that we get. These are the complaints. We get complaints that are not always, and Inez can speak more to this. We do get complaints that do not move forward into a case because there's no jurisdiction or the facts don't support it. They're not, the complaint may come in, but the facts don't support, or it doesn't have jurisdiction, or it doesn't meet the criteria for being investigated. Inez, I'll let you speak more to that. So to investigate, process, and close 30 cases is quite a lot. We're currently on track to close 45 cases this year, which is a 45% increase. In April, we see a spike in complaints due to Fair Housing Month outreach to affirmatively further fair housing. We're seeing more reasonable cause cases where the respondent is being charged with discrimination. Currently, there are 10 cause cases currently in our caseload. These require additional enforcement. 2 are state protected class only cases, and 4 more cause cases are being drafted. So Discrimination can cost, and knowing the law is beneficial to avoiding a complaint. So these are the things that can happen when a complaint has been submitted. People can retain their housing, they can get an accommodation granted. There can be an injunction, stop this behavior, monetary damages to the complainant, punitive damages, and attorney's fees and costs. So these are some of the complaint relief available. There are more depending on what's necessary to resolve the case. Penalties are steep. They start at 10,000. They can go up to 50,000. And that's at the state level. We have 3 offices. Our Carvel office building in Wilmington. We are located at in Georgetown, we're at the Bedford Street, and in Adams State Service Center, and in Dover, we're at the Cannon building. So I'm going to stop. We have time for Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and open the floor. Thank you. So I'm going to check the chat. Mia Birch says, how did the member being selected, appointed, or apply? Was this for the commission? Thank you, Mia, 1974. Yes, commissioners who are interested in serving on the commission, they can submit, and if you look on the state website, I think it's delaware.gov commissions, you'll see a list of all the commissions that exist in the state. If someone is interested in serving on the Human Relations Commission, you just simply submit an application, and then once that will go in front of the governor. And generally, people who are interested in applying, you have to fill out fill out the application for it. It's a fairly detailed application, but then once you've applied, and the governor can move it forward, and an individual who's interested in serving on the commission would then go before the executive committee and meet with members of the commission, who would then meet with the individual, ask questions, kind of like a sort of little interview. And then once that's done, then make their recommendation to the governor that they would like to add that person to the commission.
Natalie, thank you so much. I wanted to jump in there for a second, but I couldn't get myself back on the camera.
Zoom is not, I thought I knew Zoom, but sometimes Zoom just gives me agita sometimes.
Well, I'll give you a quick break because I want to ask Inez some questions.
Sure.
In the field type work. What type of cases are you able to give any examples of what you've seen over the years? Anything that would be useful, maybe just for our members to know and be aware of, that this occurs maybe more frequently than others?
I would say over the years, we've had more cases that are based on disability, both physical and mental. A lot of times, there'd be cases that we have a number of cases where people go off a practice versus a policy. So some of those things stick out the most and get individuals in our process more often. We still see cases based on race and familial status. Pretty much all the protected classes, I would say with the exception of creed, continuously still come, but disability is our biggest pocket of cases that we receive in our office.
And I think that's nationally, that's I think HUD federal still sees a majority of cases nationally are based on disability.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to, I know it's investigations, but are you able to dive into that a little more?
Yeah, with disability cases, we're talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications. So, accommodations are changes to your practices or procedures, and then modifications are structural changes. But we identify some structural changes as an accommodation versus a modification, like a designated parking space or a grab bar in the bathroom, and things of that sort. Those types of cases we definitely look to, or even, a person with a disability, they needed a co-signer. That's becoming a bigger one, where they've needed a co-signer, they provided the documentation, and just to simply say, no, we don't allow it, is really where the fair housing law comes into place, because they're asking you to make an exception to your normal policies and procedures for them so that they could equally afford, or not afford, equally be afforded the opportunity to either purchase the house, go to the house, see the house. And so those are some of the things that that we get the most of. But the designated parking, the changes with the application process, where they're asking for different things because of their disability, tend to be a number of the cases that we've been getting more often lately.
Things like, one of the things I was struck by was an individual who had, and you know which case this is, he had a visual impairment, and he asked for things either to be sent to him via email, information regarding what was happening in the building to be sent to him via email because he had a reader, or things to be delivered to him in Braille. And I think the water was shut off and he didn't know. You'll know which case this was, Inez. The water was in the elevators, I think, were being serviced, and he didn't know because his request for this kind of accommodation based on his visual disability had gone unanswered. And so he, was a man was not getting that need met, that accommodation to have the full use and enjoyment of his residence. I want to jump in real quick. Denise, thank you for your question. Denise asks, is there a form to complete if a person feels they've been discriminated against? There's 3 ways complaints can come in. People can call and they'll get a complaint form mailed to them. Our website is where most complaints come in, correct, Inez?
Yeah, it's about 50-50 between mail-ins and between online.
Yeah.
But I would think if anybody wants to file, be mindful of the statute of limitations. It's 1 year from the time period. Yeah. And that's the most important, because people will say, well, I called your office. And in housing, we have some flexibility. HUD gives us the authority to say that initial contact with our office can be secured for the complainant. But for the most times, we tell people to be mindful of that statute of limitations.
Okay. Real quick, before we dive into the one question that just came in, I did want to mention talking with the commission and Natalie and Ramona, the director, who's not on the call today, but we recently started to talk about this idea of creating a guide to fair housing for the Delaware real estate professional. So you may hear more about that in the coming months. So we may be working on that throughout the summer, hopefully this year, and get that out sometime soon. I do want to also go back to kind of an issue that we've been talking about a lot and seeing a lot of literature come out from our national association, and that's back to the appraisal bias discussion. Natalie, you mentioned the PAVE report that just came out.
Right.
I printed it. I haven't been able to quite read it yet, but
yeah, it's comprehensive.
It is. And I know our national association is going to start having some more, like I said, more notes come out about that for all our members to learn about where we are at on everything there. But I guess in Delaware in particular, have you seen bias in appraisals? Has that been something that has come up?
We've received cases on appraisals, and the interesting part, one would say they're a separate entity from not the actual real estate transaction, but from the realtor. So the realtor is trying to do this to, help you purchase the home. And then you have this appraiser who comes and appraises the home or homes. But the thing is the relationship. So a lot of times be mindful that that relationship between a realtor and whomever is giving the service to that seller or potential home buyer is equally subjective because of the relationship. So sometimes, a company will have a contract with the organization to do all their appraisals. And then of course, the seller or buyer is not, I would say, equipped to understand comps, how things are compared, where you're using, what are you using, and to look at an appraisal.
How are you adjusting the comps?
Correct, or even not even adjustment. You select homes that are not even comparable to what, and you can't pick and choose because you hope that the appraiser is making the selection and making comparables to something that is similar, even in that area. So with that being said, yeah, we've actually had a more recently, I think Michelle had a case where the appraisals comps were totally off and the realtor knew it. They knew that the house would not appraise for what the loan was going to be. And, the complainant filed a complaint with our office. I mean, we were able to conciliate the complaint, which a lot of times cases are conciliated, but it was definitely disproportionately viewed, which was not to the benefit of the buyer.
Aside from that, I'm just going to jump topics real quick because we are running out of time. We're going to do maybe another 5 to 8 minutes here.
No problem.
On the topic of service animals and emotional support animals, Natalie, are you maybe to give a quick briefing of that? And then if there's any cases that have come up here in Delaware?
So one of the things I want to mention is 2 things. ADA covers service animals. ADA service animals are dogs and possibly miniature horses. Fair Housing Act is far broader, and fair housing animals, service support and assistance animals can be any kind of animal, and it's no restrictions on breed. Horses, fish, potbelly pigs, capuchin monkeys. People have a lot more freedom in their homes for an animal that's needed as part of their disability. So there is sometimes some overlap, and under ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, a service animal can go anywhere an individual with a disability goes. Restaurants, places that serve the public, rental offices, your offices, real estate offices, your broker offices. A person with a disability under ADA can go into your facility that serves the public with that animal. 2 questions can be asked. Is this an animal needed as a result of a disability? What's it been trained to do? Fair housing is a whole different area, and I didn't get into that real broadly, but there is a lot of on the FHEO website, Fair Housing Equal Opportunity website under HUD. There's a lot of information regarding service support and assistance animals that individuals may need as it relates to a disability, and what housing providers are obligated to do.
Let me chime in for a minute. The one thing that I would differentiate, if you didn't take anything away from emotional support animals and animals that provide a physical service, is that the one individual that needs the emotional support animal, when the disability is not apparent, meaning you cannot see it, it's not visible, it's okay to ask for third-party verification of that disability. It's not, some people say, well, I don't have to, yes, if I can't see your disability, then I need to know that you in fact need this. And it has to show a direct relation between the disability and the need, because everyone with disabilities is not required to get a designated parking space in front of their unit, as an example. But if I have an emotional support animal and I have a note from the doctor or from some verifiable individual who says that this is in fact what I need, then the accommodation should be granted. And so that's one of the things that I would ever, if I ever had to make decisions with both either of the animals, it would be that the disability is not apparent, therefore I can ask for third-party verification. But if the disability is apparent, you can see that I'm blind, you can see that I'm in a wheelchair, then you don't need third-party verification. You can see it, or it's probably in their documentation. So that's one of the things. If I don't take away, you don't take anything else away, looking at that. And so, and it's okay to ask for the information. If someone tells you, I don't need to provide that, then you send them our way. Because although we educate you, we educate complainants who have yet to file something in writing, although they don't have to. And note that, some people say, oh, I have to make my request for an accommodation in writing. It does not have to be in writing. So their verbal communication to you is enough to start that process and say, I made a request. We get screenshots all day of text messages saying they made a request where the person says, oh, I can't, you have to actually give me a formal letter. None of that is true. And so text messages serve as a request. So if anything regarding the animals, just make sure if it's a parent, you don't need third-party verification. If it's not, then you do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Real quick, we'll go to this one last question here. Natalie, if you could probably tackle this one from Monica Hill. Did you see that there, the interpreter?
I did. And I'm going to toss the ball to Inez on that one.
Okay.
I'll let her go ahead and take that one.
So what's the question?
Do we have a requirement to provide an interpreter for someone who cannot hear and needs someone? I'm assuming she means buyer or prospect. For someone who cannot hear or needs someone to use sign language for them, who pays for that? It could be a lengthy process, especially now from touring on through the process and ending with settlement. So the question, do we have a requirement to provide an interpreter for someone who's hearing impaired and needs help with sign language?
That ties into the equal accommodations law, not fair housing. In fair housing, to afford somebody that same opportunity. I mean,
Buyer, Monica
if
says
it's
yes,
not,
buyer.
yeah, a buyer or seller. I mean, it's not a service that you offer, and eventually you could possibly. There are two defenses to not providing an accommodation. One is it is a financial and administrative burden, or two, it alters how you do business. Your business is selling. Now that communication, you could say, eventually that could be a financial and administrative burden to continuously provide an interpreter service through the selling process. And so that's a different one. We've never had anybody ask for an interpreter who's trying to either buy or sell a home. And so normally they know what in fact they need, and they would bring those services. Now, are you willing to, if we switch it a little bit, someone who is bilingual, are they going to bring someone to help them speak Spanish or Russian through the process so that they understand? That one we've never come across, and we could do some research on that and get back to you guys on
That's
that.
a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Buyer.
We've never had a case that's that way.
So she now has a request for an interpreter all through the buying process. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, because it's kind of covers.
But let's look up that, Natalie, and find out, because
it's a good idea.
It would be interesting to know if they made
Yeah.
that request, because you're not. That's a service that you're getting. That's not to continuously enjoy, but I guess in terms of the housing transaction, let's look that one up.
That's a good one, and we might need to kind of do a little research.
It might be the defense could be no, we can't provide it because it's a financial and administrative burden.
Correct.
Let us.
Correct. But it might also be, it might also be, provide letting being a but they can read, but it might also be differentiating yourself as a so we'll look into that.
Yeah, we'll look into that. And I would never even go with anyone to let them read lips, because I wouldn't go in that direction at all. I would either provide the service or not, but we can find out whether the defense to that.
See if there's any cases. See if there's any cases that relate to that.
Yeah, we'll look at that. Anything else?
Oh, no, we're out of time though, too. Natalie, Inez, I want to thank you both so much for being a part of this today. Great first session for us to begin Fair Housing Month.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for kicking it off. And then thank you all of our members for being here today. Again, I went through that schedule. We have a lot planned for the month, so look forward and keep an eye out for your emails for all the launches we're about to do. Again, thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Very welcome.
I think Inez is talking, but I don't know what she's saying right now.
I was just saying that our services are free. So at any given time, please feel free to contact our office so that we can either, go over the scenario and discuss it. So
yeah, we want, we appreciate being able to partner with you guys so that, we can work together to promote fair housing.
And we'll continue to grow this partnership.
Awesome. We look forward to it.
Awesome. Have a great one.
Have a great day, everybody.
You too.
Bye-bye.